Hi folks, welcome to your first of a couple of different clips from my new lecture spot in California. Not to provoke envy, but it's pretty nice out here. This week our topic is non-normative sexualities, and that's a fairly broad topic that encompasses not just whether somebody's gay or lesbian, but really anything that falls outside the heterosexual box. Remember last week when I talked about sexuality initially, I spoke about a tripartite sort of analytical division where, to begin with, you had desires, then you had acts. Desires might or might not actually translate into acts. And then thirdly, the social meanings that are attached to those desires and acts, as well as the individual level meanings which are attached. And of course, individual meanings can never be really fully separated from the social and cultural as well as the political context. In this clip, I'm going to be talking about different kinds of sexual orientations and some of the consequences that come along with being a non-normative or having a non-normative form of desire or engaging in non-normative acts in our society. In subsequent clips, I'll talk about the legal situation for people who are not heterosexual. And then in a third one, I intend to talk about trans people, people who are transgender or transsexual. So those will be tabled for later. So to start off with, what do I mean when I talk about non-normative sexuality? Again, it's anybody who does not fall into that standard box of sort of heterosexual, predictable, socially acceptable kinds of sexuality. And most of the folks who fall outside of that box have done so in the recent past and also historically because they, in one way or another, did not conform in their sexual orientation. So when we're talking about sexual orientation, there are the familiar terms like gay, which can be applied to both men and women. In the narrower sense, is often applied more just to men. Lesbians, which applies entirely to women who are attracted to other women. But then there are more complicated categories. Heterosexual is, of course, also an orientation, although oftentimes, like whiteness, like being middle class, it's unremarked upon, it's taken for granted, it's simply taken to be the norm, and therefore understudied in a lot of ways. And then beyond that, you've got people who don't fit into a simple box. You've got folks who are bisexual, which might mean that they're equally attracted to both sexes, but it also might mean that they're predominantly attracted to one sex and not the other. There are a lot of myths about bisexuals, and some of them you'll read about in this week's article by Robin Oakes and Marcia Deal. One of them was mentioned to me by a student just the other day, not in one of your classes, but a different student, who said, the fact that I'm bi makes everybody believe that I'm immediately up for a threesome. And, the face she made is about the one I'm making right now. It's like, no, that's not what being bisexual is about. It's about your capacity. And like I said, sometimes people who are bisexual are equally attracted. Some people might be primarily hetero in their leanings. Others might be primarily homosexual in their leanings. It's entirely individual. Back in the 40s and 50s, one of the first serious sex researchers in the United States, Alfred Kinsey, came up with a scale with the numbers 1 through 7 to try to capture the fact that people aren't simply gay or straight. There are shades of gray in between, and some people will land entirely in the middle, some people at either extreme, and then some people might have a mix of desires. Now, this idea of desires being mixed or fluid or not simply categorized has been expanded upon in recent years by a relatively new category, that of pansexual, which refers to people who don't necessarily want to be constrained by the gender binary. A pansexual person might say, yes, I'm attracted to men, I'm attracted to women, but maybe I'm attracted to trans men too, or anybody who's transgender, potentially, if it's the right person. Pansexuality basically tries to get rid of that simple binary that we so often use when we think about gender and sexuality. And for that reason, some people find it a more attractive label than bisexuality because it's less constraining and doesn't sort of lay a gender trip on people. Sometimes you hear the word omnisexual used as a kind of synonym for pansexual, not nearly as often, and there's something about it, I think, because it shares the root with the word omnivorous, and because of that, sort of, inadvertently adds to the idea that bisexuals just want to get it on with anybody. No. And so you'll see that term once in a while, and I want you to know what it means, but it's not a terribly broadly used term. Then, in the last 5 years or so, the term asexual has begun to be more recently used as well. Primarily, in my experience in internet communities, I've never had a student come to me and say, hey, I'm asexual and I'm trying to negotiate this. I am aware that there was a student trying to start an interest group somewhere on campus. I don't think that that ever really got off the ground substantially. But basically, asexuals either don't feel desire for explicitly sexual contact. In some cases, they don't want to have a romance or partnership. But more commonly, they do have the desire for closeness. Maybe they want to cuddle, maybe they want to hold hands, maybe they want to kiss. But for one reason or another, they don't want to go all the way, however you want to define that, heterosexually, non-heterosexually, or whatever. So somebody could be primarily lesbian in orientation and also asexual at the same time. These are terms that can layer on top of each other. Like I say, it's not one you're going to hear a lot in daily life, and it's one that I don't question people's self-identification. I don't question the reality of asexuality. I do sometimes wonder if, in some cases, it's something hormonal going on with the person, or something that may be rooted in experience, if they've had an aversive experience with sexuality, trauma or abuse at a young age. It's certainly understandable that someone might not want to get involved on a very intimate level with somebody else. By saying that, I don't want to pathologize asexuality either, though, and it may very well be. I think it probably is the case that for some people it's simply the way they're built and wouldn't necessarily require medical attention or any kind of intervention or whatever. I think it's very hard to talk about asexuality, and it's hard to conceptualize it because our society, as we discussed when we looked at advertising, is all about sex, sex, sex. Everywhere is sex. And if you don't meet that mold somehow, in some ways you appear as more deviant than somebody who falls outside the gaps when it comes to sexual orientation or something like that. Now, there are a couple of other categories that deserve mention more or less in the same breath as orientation, but it's more controversial as to whether these categories really should be considered an orientation, whether they should be considered a lifestyle, some kind of, simply sexual choice that people make. The first category I want to mention in this regard is polyamory. If you've watched Sister Wives, you probably have some idea that not everybody out there lives monogamously, and some people live in consensual arrangements where they have, multi-adult households or stable long-term relationships. And that is the idea of consensual non-monogamy, broadly speaking. Now, there are a number of different terms that can be used to describe this, and I think the most ethically defensible one, and ethically unproblematic one, although still I think personally and romantically very complicated one, is polyamory. That's when people decide that they are free to get involved with other partners sexually and emotionally. And it's not the same as polygamy, so if you're thinking about sister wives, in that situation you really do have a pretty inegalitarian power structure. You've got a very male-dominant household. And where we talk about polygamy, generally that inequality is present. Polygamy refers, strictly speaking, or at least in popular usage, it refers to having multiple wives. Strictly speaking, polygyny would be the term for multiple wives, and polyandry is the term for having multiple husbands. But in popular shorthand in the media, you'll hear polygamy used almost exclusively to refer to a multiple wife situation. Polyandry is also not the same thing as swinging. Swinging is when couples decide that they're going to get together with another couple, or sometimes parties with other couples, and have sexual contact with others, but without any real significant emotional involvement. And as such, it's often described by those who practice it as strengthening that dyad and not as undermining it. My own personal feeling is that anytime you introduce more people into a situation, it's more complex, it's more unstable, just sort of by the nature of the beast. The more parties you add to something, the more possibilities there are for people to come into conflict, for jealousy to occur, and so on. But that's my own personal perspective on it, and there are certainly people who make these arrangements work and who are happy in it. And as such, I would make the same argument there as I would for gay and lesbian arrangements or bisexual relationships, that this is a matter for personal choice and not for the law to try to regulate. Okay, so now that I've talked about different kinds of orientations, and bear in mind that these last two categories, I have not quite covered it all. One other category that sometimes can be grouped under orientation is that of people who are kinky, kinksters, people who practice BDSM. I feel like I have to explain a lot less about this now that 50 Shades of Grey is out there. All the women have at least seen it, if not read it, and quite possibly your mothers or grandmothers have read this. I think that kink in a lot of ways is going mainstream these days, and whether it should be considered an orientation, again, that's another question, and I don't think there's real science. I mean, these are social categories anyway, so there's not real science to say, okay, this is hardwired or not hardwired. We don't have that kind of science for sexual orientation anyway. But what kinksters are looking for, and what practitioners of polyamory are seeking, is recognition that there is a perfectly normal, non-deviant, and therefore ought to be legal way of living out their intimate lives. So that's my overview of sexual orientation. I want to say a few words about how we set up penalties and rewards for different kinds of orientations in our society. Now, if you even take these categories in the first place, the whole idea of a sexual orientation is a modern one. If you went back 500 years to early modern England, you might find somebody being prosecuted for the crime of sodomy. That's to say that some guy was caught making intimate contact with some other dude, and they were busted and they were punished for it. But that made the two participants in that act sodomites. It did not make them homosexuals in the sense that we would now perceive it to mean somebody with a relatively stable identity over time who is consistently attracted to the opposite sex. That idea of consistent attraction and therefore orientation is a highly modern idea that really only developed in the 19th century as a result of sexologists starting to categorize and catalog all different kinds of human behaviors, all kinds of fetishes, everything from guys who like toes to people who love feathers and whatever else. And at that point, these categories of heterosexual and homosexual began to get the imprimatur of scientific respectability, scientific meaningfulness, and at that point they became stable social categories ultimately as well. This had a very negative side, obviously, for folks who were then stigmatized and pathologized and persecuted under the law. It was illegal in most states to practice homosexual acts in many countries. Only in the post-World War II era were such laws struck down, and in the United States it was only in 2003 that sodomy laws were struck down nationwide. So that had a long and sordid history. But on the other hand, creating the category of the homosexual also then created a basis for political unity, for an identity that could be used for legislating and advocating for rights over time. So it had this very double-edged sword aspect to it.